Okay, everyone, welcome, welcome. I hope you're having a good evening. And we're here to today discuss a very interesting subject, modern Assyrianism and modern Assyrian identity and its internal debates or conflicts. We could say conflicts at certain times, but I think debates are more appropriate now. Now, this is a two-part lecture, so make sure you're here today and you're here next week, same time, same place. So before we begin, I would like to ask my dear and trusty assistants, Ms. Sarah Gou and Mr. Pierre Yonan, a couple of questions and have you think about their answers, well, both the questions and the answers, as we go through this lecture. Sarah, a member of our community identifies herself as Chaldean, yet speaks your language, practices your culture and traditions, eats your food, so on and so forth, but traces her history different from yours. She sees, for example, Nebuchadnezzar and not Ashurbanipal as an ancestor. She views Babylon and not Nineveh as an ancient city to which she belongs, for example. Are you and her the same ethnicity or nationality or not?
Well, thank you, Rabi. What a question.
Go
Let me
ahead.
get yours here. So to put it plainly, yes, we are the same ethnicity. We are one. But I guess it's appropriate to start with the origin of the terms, right? So obviously we covered Alturaya comes from Assyria, the land of Ashur, and this is, ancient, native, and historically documented term. And it has a direct connection to the land, the people, and the empire. And then even you can really see from various royal inscriptions and how Assyrian kings relay that connection between the land and the people. Um, the term Chaldean, unlike Assyrian, does not. I mean, there's no real cuneiform records of a people called Chaldeans. As you stated in your question, and this was something I remember I looked into. I think from your 2020 2021 class, but the Chaldeans basically they see Nebuchadnezzar as their ancestor, as you mentioned in your question. But Nebuchadnezzar never really calls himself Chaldean. The term is not really a native identifier. And I know that biblical interpretations obviously it complicates this matter, which I'm not really gonna get into for brevity's sake here. But to move on to church affiliation and the importance of religion and kind of shaping these identifiers, you know, Assyrian Church of the East, its members traditionally identified as Assyrians, but really in the early history of the church, um, the term Chaldean was not really used to separate the people who, adopted Catholicism from the people who did not. But over time, really, we see that Chaldean kind of became restricted to Catholics while Assyrian was used by the outside. Um, and as for the language, I mean, they both speak the same language, and that's quite evident. Um, Really in the books we have today, especially the dictionaries, a few dictionaries that are in the Ashurbanipal library in which we sell, you know, very old dictionaries that have been later reprinted use the term Chaldean. Um, and really it's just a respected label that is kind of just rooted in biblical tradition, but at its core it refers to the same language. And I always get Assyrian patrons buying the books and loving the books, but all in all, the terms they're no different. They go back to the same origin. We share the same ancestry and homeland. We share the same language. We share the same culture, and we're essentially the same people. And then the division was later imposed. But yes, again, I just want to give a quick shout out to Rabi Robert because he has an excellent video on this topic from one of his classes, I think 2021. But I remember watching those classes when I first started working at the foundation. Super helpful stuff. You can find it on the Assyrian Cultural Foundation YouTube channel. But yeah, that's my answer. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Sarah. The two plugs, very important plugs, one for the books of the library and one for an old video. Um, okay, so I guess what you're saying, Sarah, is, and it's something to think about as we explore this class, is, well, you may have disagreements about historical issues and historical lineages, the fact that you are one in terms of language and culture and so on and so forth overcomes other differences, perhaps imagined differences like, Benedict Anderson. We've looked at this theorist, imagined communities. Your friend is imagining something different in the past, a different type of connection. You are one. You are one people in terms of everything else. It's just the looking back at the past that you disagree with, right? Okay, good, good. All right. All right. So far, oneness is winning. 1 for oneness, 0 for division. Pierre, I have a question for you. A member of our community identifies himself as Syriac or Syriani in Arabic, Surioyo or Suriaya, and says you too are a member of the Syriac community and you're not Assyrian. A few years ago, he called himself an Assyrian. He admitted that he was an Assyrian, or that's the way he viewed his identity. Now he doesn't. He says he has educated himself with books written by Adam Becker, John Joseph, and others, Coakley, and so on. And he's come to this conclusion. Can you still be considered members of one nation or ethnicity, you and this person?
This is a question that strikes really deeply at what we presently experience. Obviously, I think there's no doubt we are part of one people, regardless of what you say or what you choose to identify yourself as. You are still a part of the nation, um, especially even if this individual, while he may not identify as Assyrian, if he does things that actively work towards the goals of the nation, such as preservation of the language, the culture, and whatnot, these are things that are ultimately serving the purpose of the Assyrian nation. Um, I often think back to a figure, this question, when I heard it, the first thing I thought of was the former patriarch of the Syriac Orthodox Church, Mor Afram Barsum. Well, they all take the name Ignatius, but I'm just gonna say Mor Afram Barsum. He was one of the lead figures in the Paris Peace Conference delegation representing the Assyro-Chaldean delegation, that specifically claimed to represent the Assyrian people of Mesopotamia. And, after the failure of the conference to secure any lasting rights for Assyrians, the patriarch over time began to change his tune in terms of, by the 1950s, he wrote an article and, it was sent all across to the Syriac Orthodox community in America that they should not be identifying as Assyrian, they should identify as Syriani. This is a name of pride, and ultimately it comes from Aramean. But he made this claim, should I say, no, Mur Afram Barsum is not a part of my nation? No, of course he's a part of my nation. He's a part of the history of my nation. Just because he decided to reject it doesn't mean that he's not a part of it. Recently, someone that you knew, Robert, Marsar Hajjamo passed away recently. Marsar Hajjamo in the 90s, there's very clear video evidence and, him saying it, saying that, we are Assyrian, Baba Watan Fahmi, our fathers understood. And then later on, he goes to say other things. Does that mean that Sarhad Jammu, Sarhad Jammu is not a part of our nation? Of course he is. Whether or not he chooses to accept that, that is something you're born into. And at the end of the day, it's on me to love this person like a brother anyways. And I think that's really one of the hardest things we struggle with is choosing to love this person anyways, despite that, as a brother. It doesn't mean we can't disagree with them. It's very funny. In Sweden, there's two brothers. There's the Ego brothers. One is a host for Surioyo Sat, and I think the other one's a host for Assyria TV. They're both brothers.
Yes.
They both share the same father.
Yes.
And one is Oromoyo, and the other one is Othoroyo. And yet they're both brothers. And this kind of shows a division that happens in our nation, right? They're both the same people. They're both genetically the same individual, right? They share the same DNA, but yet they're considering themselves differently. in reality, we know the truth, you know, in our language, regardless of the exonym you want to use, whether it be Aramean, Chaldean, Assyrian, these are words in English. In our language, we call ourselves Suraya. That's been true. That word comes from Assyrian. You know, if people want to debate that, they can, but, you know, there's facts and then there's feelings. So for me, we're all Assyrian. Even if you choose not to embrace that, you're Assyrian to me, so I'm going to treat you as if you were an Assyrian. And that's what I would say to my Syriac brother, who, unfortunately, even if he chose to embrace other people's thoughts about our community, you know, I'm not going to change his mind. He has to change his mind for himself. And yeah.
Excellent. So a quick question for you, follow up, Pierre, on Afram Barsoum. What do you think led to, because we've speculated about this in the past, about his shift. Actually, John Joseph mentions that he goes into the Paris Peace Conference, you know, thinking one way, just as you said, and then later he just turns against, you know, the idea of Assyria, whereas before he encourages it. And then later, of course, he said, don't even use the word, but he's known by many of the Arab compatriots, you know, members of other representations as Qass al-Zaman or Qass al-Uruba, which means the priest of Arabism or the priest of the ages. So they praise him because he defends the rights of the Arabs. What do you think led, as far as you know, to his you know, change or about face in all of this?
There's a good book written about this. It's called The Heirs of Patriarch Shakar, written by Ogun Kortananike. You can get it on, I believe, Nineveh Press's website.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's a very difficult book to acquire. But it's a great book, and it kind of discusses this. So first off, you know, this author, he applies what he believes is his own feelings on this. I'll say that. But I think one thing is that Mur Afram was a politician in this case. He wanted to do what he could to preserve his community. And I think the big striking point for most our denominational differences in ethnic separatism can really be traced back to one event, being the Semed massacre of 1933, when you see an Arabist government essentially declare war on the Assyrian identity and Assyrian national interests. And from that point on, it becomes a matter of self-preservation. So for Afram Barsoum, you want to protect your community, you want your community to be respected, and you want it to be preserved. And to do that, he believed he needed to play ball with the Arab governments. And, you know, maybe that was obviously not the appropriate thing to do, I would say. You know, you shouldn't sell yourself to something. Other people can maybe disagree, but because of that, he changed his tune. He changed his tune to suit what was more popular at the time. And you even see this shift occurring in the general mentality of the people of the Syriac Orthodox Church. So in Mosul, for example, there is a man who writes to Farid Nuzha, who is in Argentina at this time, who's publishing a newspaper. And he writes to him and he says that, oh, and please, from your newspaper, because you are Syriac Orthodox, Farid, drop the name Ashuri from the Arabic title of your newspaper, because Ashuri is for the Nestorian. And, you know, the Semed massacre just happened. And Farid responds to him and says, you know, what a simpleton you must be to not understand that the word Suryani, in which you call yourself in Arabic, is a derivative of the word Assyria in Greek, corrupted into Arabic by the Turkish and the Persian. Okay? And he says, Ashuri is the same thing. So he said, if being called Ashuri means I am an Nestorian, then I am proud to share the same name with the people who died for this name. And I think this is something important to consider when you think about why mentality shifted. You know, violence is a big part of that. I think people are so quick to say, oh, they don't want to call themselves Assyrian. They don't want to be Assyrian. You have to understand why this occurred. You know, now this is generational, because 1933 was, you know, a lot of people's great grandfathers or grandfathers were alive in that point. You now have kids growing up in the aftermath of this. grandkids, great-grandkids, and they've grown up with a certain conception that's developed about Assyrian identity, whether or not they know it. And I think that's important when you think about these kinds of subjects.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent references. Yes, I'm familiar with the heirs of Shakar. He's very strong on the Assyrian from the Assyrian viewpoint, but I think he makes a lot of good points in that book. A very well written book, by the way. So when I do the next 10 books that you should read, I think I should include that book because it is very, very perceptive, very poignant, and goes into detail in a lot of newspapers and articles, and shows even in Turkey how the Patriarch shifted their policies.
If
All
you
right,
would
thank you
allow
for
me
that.
really
Sorry.
quick to add one
Sure.
note, sorry, to that. You know, I think it's a very important book because here among us Madenchaye, us Easterners, understanding what the politics that goes on in the Western Church, the Syriac Orthodox Church, is not always so clear to us. It's something we really don't hear about because most of their diaspora politics occurs in Europe, while ours are mostly done in America. So while you or I are familiar with something like Sarhad Jammo, and other people might be familiar with Sarhad Jammo's flipping of identity, as that's much more common to us, much more close to us. People we know, for example, you knew Sarhad Jammo, you know, in Europe, it's an entirely different political battle that went in with the Syriac Orthodox Church. And, you know, most of our community was not privy to that, to understand what occurred. So I think it's a really good book that sheds light onto that. I just really wanted to say, because for me, I like reading about what has gone on. It's kind of hard to find stuff about the Syriac Orthodox Church and its internal debates and politics that has happened in the past 30 to 40 years. But this is something that the author does a great job of tackling, like you said, with newspapers, with references. Obviously, he's lived through much of it. He includes pictures of himself serving on the altar as a subdeacon. So you knew he was a present and faithful member of the church to be able to comment on this.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, Pierre. And I think it would be good to read that book with, I think, along John Joseph's book, although they don't go necessarily into the same subjects, but they both have something to contribute to have a better rounded picture. All right, with that, that letter, if you, I'm familiar with that letter, Pierre, that you mentioned, where he's answering this concern. If you have it, is it in the book or where have I seen it?
It's in a Sargon Donabed article
Okay,
that he
okay,
wrote about the ethnic identity of Syriac Orthodox Christians / Jacobites.
okay, okay. Is it the full reproduced letter, or is it?
I believe that what he does is he posts what he has is what's his name's response. Farid knows not what's his name. Farid Nusa's response
Yeah,
in the newspaper. That is what he takes. He takes that portion that serves as the response and he puts that in the article, the full
yeah.
response.
Very important letter. Very important letter. And speaks to the mindset of many of our people. Okay, with that, Pierre and Sarah and all of you, again, welcome. And let's go into this, the modern Assyrian identity and its internal debates. So we could say, as Sarah and Pierre clearly laid out, that we are definitely one nation, and we're going to look at how this is determined. We're going to look at some theoretical frameworks of how this is determined, and that our people throughout the centuries have used different terminology, or different terminology has been used on our people. So Assyrian has been used, Syriac, and oftentimes we would say, instead of Syriac, we would say Suraya, we would say Suryaya or Suryoya, and then we added an Arabic understanding of that, and we say Syrianaya. This is kind of an addition, something I never heard growing up, other than in Arabic, of course, Syriani in Arabic, but I never heard an Assyrian saying the word Syrianaya. And then I heard this also. So kind of multiplying identities, Chaldean, Aramean, and Aramean is, of course, more recent. We're going to look at that. A Nestorian was used. Growing up, I heard this. My grandmother used this term. Nostornae, Echni Nostornae, we are Nostornae. I mean, we heard this. I also heard her refer to Chaldeans as Prangae instead of Keldae. She never used the word Keldae. She used Prangae. And so all these names, some are considered derogatory. Nestorian is, we say today it's not appropriate, even if some of our people did use it because it was imposed on them or they heard it used. But I think it's important to know that all of these terms somehow refer to either all of these people or a segment of these people. Now, who are these people that we're talking about? Well, we know that we often hear the expressions West Syriacs and East Syriacs, Western Syrians, Eastern Syrians, constantly used in literature. By Eastern Syrians, we mean, linguistically, people to the east of the Tigris, and those to the west of the Tigris are Western. We were on a trip in the Hakkari Mountains, and we joked around when we were crossing the Tigris. Some of our people from Tur Abdin said, now we can all speak Madanhaya because we have crossed the Tigris into Madanha. So the language changes, just kind of joking around, but realizing we're all the same people. But basically, the people in the area of Hakkari, the people in Tur Abdin, Urmia, Salamas, the Nineveh Plain, all of these people used, the term Suraya to apply to themselves in different variations, of course. And so it could easily be said that they were part of one demography, one geography, one historical development, all of them living in these areas. This is not far. This is not an area that's gigantic. It's not exactly an empire. It is looking like a small European country or a small Middle Eastern country. So how do we determine that it is one nation and not many? Eric Hobsbawm tells us that nations without a past are contradictions in terms. What makes a nation is the past. What justifies one nation against others is the past, and historians are the people who produce it. Now, it's important that this term historians, we understand it, because we're going to come across many historians. One of them was my good friend Sarhad Jammu, and he was not necessarily an academic on this topic, but he did study this a lot, and he loved his people, and he loved his language and traditions and so on. And believe it or not, I have a lot of good things to say about the late Sarhad Jammu, Bishop Sarhad Jammu. And some people may disagree with me, but I think he had a lot of good points to express about his people. And so we had disagreements, of course, but by and large, Sarhad Jammu contributed to the development of people, particularly in Michigan, one of our largest communities in the United States, to understand that they had a heritage that was valuable. They had a religious legacy that was valuable, members of the Church of the East, Chaldean Church of the East in the case of Sarhad Jammu, but shared traditions with the Assyrian Church of the East. At any rate, a lot of these historians would be producing or reimagining a history. So the example we gave Sarah, to which she responded very well, was, you to imagine kind of a different history. Of course, we're not in touch with Nebuchadnezzar. We're not in touch technically with Ashurbanipal in this way that we're, talking to them and addressing them, and he knows us and we know them. This is across, of course, many centuries. So what's required is, in addition to our understanding, is a little bit of imagination. But Sarah was right to point out that there is also some historical truth that we need to be concerned about. So objectively, we would say From one perspective, that's called the primordial or essentialist perspective, we say common language, Surit, for example, although sometimes we say, well, it's not really essential. There are countries that don't have the same language, and there are countries, 2 countries or 3 countries that share the same language but consider themselves separate nations or are, in fact, politically separate nations. Shared territory or homeland, as you saw in the area of the what we call the Assyrian people or the Syriac speaking people or Aramean people or Chaldean people, they all are relatively from the same area. Shared religion or cultural practices, all of our people are Christian. Common descent, ethnicity, the belief in common blood or ancestry. So sometimes you have people saying, yeah, we're Chaldean and you're Assyrian, but Keldu and Ashur were brothers. And so we share this, blood, mythical blood ancestry. And sometimes other people say, well, no, these were 2 separate peoples. And that's kind of helped along by even Western understanding of the dichotomy of Babylonia and Assyria. One of those is Eckhart Fromm, for example. He creates this very coherent entity called Babylonia. Says, for example, that the Assyrians kind of took the heritage of Babylonia, took the literature, took the religion, took the myths and culture and so on, and they felt that they owed a debt to Babylonia and felt a certain kind of inferiority complex towards Babylonia. Well, where does this come from? It comes from the creation by this historian of this entity, a very coherent entity that contains all of these characteristics. A shared history. So now we named 5 things here. So maybe there's disagreements about a shared history, or maybe there's different views of a shared history, but does that overturn everything? So the criticism is that these traits can oftentimes overlap, and sometimes people may disagree. Well, there's also subjective criteria, and theorists stress that nations exist because people believe. I believe I'm an Assyrian. So sometimes people would kind of defend themselves because there were, in the past, many years ago, this doesn't happen anymore, but people would say, well, I thought, a professor would say in a class, I thought the Assyrians disappeared. And someone would say, well, I'm an Assyrian. Well, how do you know you're an Assyrian? And the person would say, well, I believe I'm an Assyrian, therefore I am. So collective self-identification, members think of themselves as part of a distinct people. We believe that we share this heritage with our ancestors. We have a political will, a desire, for example, to share a destiny together. We are an imagined community in a way. Now, this is not a bad thing necessarily. Some people believe it to be, well, complete reconstruction of what historical truth is, but it's a belief in, or a belief that is kind of based on historical truths being put together, a la Benedict Anderson, imagined communities. Mass mobilization. A nation exists when elites or populations organize. Elites such as Sarah Gou and Pierre organizing around nationhood and kind of explaining it to people, and others, of course. Well, there's a middle ground also. Scholars like Anthony Smith, whose writings I'm very familiar with, and I've read many interviews, and some things I agree with him and others I don't. And he argues that nations are modern, but build on older ethnic communities. He calls them ethnes. And he says, you can't just imagine this stuff. There has to be something, a shared name. Well, maybe sometimes it's not necessarily the same name. Well, it's a close name, or it's a shared series of names together, Chaldaya, Aturaya, Suryaya. A myth of common ancestry. Well, why is it called a myth? Because the people are kind of imagining this kind of ancestry, not necessarily based on a truth, but based on something we imagine, something we take from poets, of our nation, something we hear in songs. Shared historical memories, one or more cultural elements, language, custom, religion, All of those are shared by all of those different nomenclatures that we shared with you in the beginning. A link with a historic territory, certainly the case of the Assyrian people, no matter how we define them. Some define this entity as Aramean, some define it as Assyrian, so on and so forth. Okay, fine. But still, the historic territory is the same. A sense of solidarity, especially among the elites, the powerful in the community. So this is something to think about. That's very, very important in the community. And at times there are major disagreements. At times there are agreements among the elites. So just again, underlying theories to see the modernist and the constructivist theories, Ernest Gellner versus Benedict Anderson. He says nations are a product of modernity, especially in industrial society. Things happen in industrial society. Benedict Anderson says a nation is an imagined political community that is both inherently limited and sovereign, limited in the sense that it has some imagined borders around it. I am in, you are out, etc. Ernest Gellner says shared standardized high culture through education, print, administration, homogeneity of that culture, etc. Benedict Anderson tells us that members imagine belonging together despite never meeting. Print capitalism enables this kind of imagination to grow in the minds of people. So remember, in connection with people like Benjamin Arsanis and people like now other people, we're going to talk about Johnny Meso's theory about Aramean identity to try to come to understand how this goes. Also a sense of horizontal camaraderie. We are all the same. We are all Assyrian. We are all Aramean. Ernest Gellner says nations do not precede nationalism. Nationalism creates the nation. So first we develop these ideas and then we force it on to the people who are members of the nation. And Benedict Anderson focuses on subjective imagination, not objective traits. Subjective imagination, meaning we think and we form all of this in our mind, a little bit Kantian, and we say, you know, we are members of this nation. Now, we talked about these terms, so let's talk about first, let's begin with understanding. You've understood Assyrianism. I'm going to talk about it at the end of this class. What was it? What does it mean? What is its philosophy? What is this ideology of Assyrianism? But let's first understand all these other movements. What is the Aramean movement? First of all, very important that we realize this is a later, much later than Assyrianism kind of idea. Okay, now this is not saying terms were not used, and we're going to go into that, but it's definitely coming after the 1950s. And also important to remember that this was not driven in the homeland, but driven in the diaspora. Okay, and particularly among one segment of our community or our people in the Syriac Orthodox, emphasizing descent from the Arameans rather than the Assyrians, not both. So it's a rejection of the idea that we are descendants of the Assyrians. And we uphold the idea that we are Arameans. So it arose as an alternative to the ideas propounded by people like Freydun Aturaya, Adde Alkhas, John Alkhas, and others that we've talked about and others that you know about. And it picked up in particular in Europe, in Germany and other places, in Central Europe and other places where our people live. While it provides cultural pride and language, a based identity also contributes to fragmentation within the Syriac Orthodox Church itself, because there are people within the Syriac Orthodox Church that reject it and believe in Assyrianism, and there are others who say, let's just stick to the word Syriac. Let's not go back to this word Aramean, or let's not go forward to the word Aramean. Let's stick to the word Syriac. Syriac is closer to something else, Assyrian, and we don't differentiate between Assyrians and Arameans. Let's just say we are descendants of both of them and a couple of other people, and Syriac is better. So there are these within the Syriac Orthodox Church, these debates, and at times they were very violent debates. And this idea was built. There was a book called The Pearl that an introduction was written by, and I don't think he meant to advocate the kind of mentality that was in this book, but Sebastian Brock, who's a well-known Syriac scholar, this book went back over history and basically made various claims. Like, for example, this book was published by the Syriac Universal Alliance and the Syriac Orthodox Church. And basically, it put forth this idea that we were always a separate people. We have nothing to do with the Assyrians. In fact, the Assyrians committed a holocaust, and there was a video also supporting these sets of books that the Assyrians committed the first Holocaust against the Arameans. So clearly, this was a very anachronistic way of understanding history, and it pushed this idea of a very separate past between Assyrians and Arameans and a rejection of the Assyrian idea. Yet at the same time saying, hey, what we're saying is we're all one. We just don't want to agree with the word Assyrian. We want to agree with the word Aramean. Well, the role of the Syriac Orthodox Church, Pierre pointed to Sargon-Donabet having done work. Actually, Sargon-Donabet comes from both the Syriac Orthodox and the Church of the East background. And in his book, he tells us that among the majority of the late 19th and early 20th century Syrian or Syriac Orthodox intellectual, it's apparent that the predominant affiliation was to the word Assyrian or Aturaya. And Syriaya meant Aturaya, or Suryoyo meant Othoroyo. The Syriac Orthodox clergy was paradoxically both instrumental in advancing secular Assyrianism in the beginning, as we talked about. We named Afram Barsum, as Pierre pointed out too. And then both instrumental in advancing secular Assyrianism and later reducing it by creating a separate Aramean or Syrian identity. Really, Aramean is the main one that is more antagonistic. Syriac says, all right, whatever you say our past is pre-Christian past, I don't want to hear it. I really am focused on, it could be true, it could be not true, but I'm focused on the Syriac identity. But Aramean says, no, I'm rejecting the Assyrian identity in favor of a new identity. Now, was in fact the Syriac Orthodox Church using the word Assyrian? Well, it still does on the east coast of the United States. And clearly the word Assyrian was not rejected. In the beginning, the word Assyrian Orthodox Church was applied to churches in the United States, particularly St. Mary's Church in New Jersey. And that's still the case, although, a different generation came and emphasized kind of the oneness with the rest of the church. And so, rather than calling the patriarch the Assyrian Patriarch of Antioch, well, let's call him the Syriac Patriarch of Antioch, because at a certain time, the word Syrian was also used by the Greek Orthodox or Rome Orthodox, who called themselves Syrian Orthodox in the United States. But anyway, this became a bit of a battle, and there was actually certain times vandalism committed against this church by, I guess, certain members who did not like this term and tried to change it. But it still stuck around, and it's still around today. It's one of the, I believe, the only church that uses the term Assyrian rather than Syriac Orthodox Church, and is in the east coast of the United States. So along comes one of the advocates of Arameanism, let's call it that, kind of an awkward term, a little harder to say than Assyrianism, but I mean, it's a word now. And Johnny Meso, a young, very active, very intelligent, I would say, whether we disagree with him or not is a different issue, but he is definitely a very active person in the church and in the uh, rest of society about this um, issue. And he has written a book. And he says, well, Assyrian was imagined by our people, and that's not the case historically. And so he goes to the word Aramean. Now he writes an article that is key, and it's featured in the World Council of Arameans. It's an organization, an NGO that is a member of the United Nations. And he writes this article, Arameanism Oromoyutho, as the key to our future survival. Okay. And he says, let's learn from the Jewish people. And he says, in the Jewish diaspora, it was threatened by anti Semitism and by assimilation. What was the solution? Zionism. So we, members of the Syriac Orthodox Church and other churches, need to get an identity in the world that we live in, because we cannot just remain a religious identity. So we need a clear ideology, a clear reference to a past, clear identification of the threats, shared goals, despite disagreements, strong ideology uniting secular and religious, patience, persistence, and internal diplomacy. Lesson for Arameans: need to clear vision, unity, and national idea. So this is where the word Aramean comes in, and it's a very, very important move from understanding ourselves as a religious people. Are we just Christians? Well, in the West, we can't be just Christians. We have to be something else. So we must have a reintroduction to our history. And he says that in the pre-1914 era, prior to the First World War I, Arameans lived peacefully in the Ottoman Empire. And as some of you may know, that Johnny Meso made good connections with the current Turkish government. He did talk about massacres, destruction of villages, cultural devastation, but he's very political in his approaches. Post 1918, split across Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, assimilation pressures in the rest of the world. Post 1960s, mass migration to Europe and diaspora communities. He's looking at all of the churches considered Aramean, including the Church of the East, or the Nestorian, in his mind, Nestorian Church. Threats in the homeland: anti-Christian, anti-Aramean violence, he calls it. So whenever the word Syriac or Syriani is mentioned, he switches to, and the Aramean Council insists on the word being Aramean rather than Assyrian, as in some examples. Ethnic cleansing and forced assimilation in the East, threats in the diaspora. Of course, rapid assimilation. This is a challenge for all of the communities in the diaspora. Core questions were how to maintain solidarity, how to preserve identity and language, which name unites us, Suryoyo, or Syrian, or Syriac, or Aramean, which one unites us better? And of course, his answer is Aramean is the proper word for us. Why? Because we are the sons of Aram in biblical language. We also have the Aramaic language. So this is the beginning for us. We have some historical truth here in the Aramaic language. And he says academic consensus is that the word Syrian or Syriac means Aramean. So Lishana Suryaya or Suryoyo means Aramaya or Oromoyo. So Aramean preferred for clarity and historical authenticity, because it goes back to the pre-Christian times, and it has as its goal a new understanding of our past, our old centuries. So Aramaicism is literature and culture, Aramaith, okay? Arameandom, the people, the world of Arameans, Aramaeanism, modern national idea for survival. So countering Assyrianism. If we're going to have Assyrianism advocated by Freydun Aturaya and Benjamin Arsanis, well, then let's have Arameanism advocated by Johnny Meso and others. Safeguard and develop cultural heritage and identity, protect communal solidarity and cohesion. I bring these up to you because do they sound familiar to you as any kind of people struggling to survive? Well, of course. And what's the conclusion? Arameanism is the banner for unity and survival. And by the way, unity is not let us members of the Syriac Orthodox Church separate from the Church of the East and the Chaldean Church and the Syriac Catholic Church. No, Arameanism is unity and survival for all of us together. Not about separatism or militancy, but living for a national ideal in the diaspora and in the homeland. So key to resisting assimilation and ensuring continuity of the Aramean people in the homeland and diaspora. Now, do you think everybody has agreed with this? Well, of course not. Why? Because our understanding of history is different than our understanding of tradition. Maybe tradition, sometimes we remember. Well, we could argue about that too, but a lot of times we say, well, traditionally, we do this, we do X, Y, and Z. But historically, well, I've read it and I've interpreted it, and we're now lost in the diaspora. So we don't have all our traditions with us, but we can certainly have a collective history. And this is the offer that Johnny Meso is giving. And this is basically, in a nutshell, and I'm just going to go over some points so that you fully understand what is it that Aramean nationalism or Arameanism is advocating. That the Arameans have a history of more than 3,000 years old in the various areas of the Middle East, Southeast Turkey, Iraq, so on. Aramaic is a sister language of Hebrew and Arabic, not of any other language, I guess, and is the second language of the Bible. From the 7th century BC until the 7th century AD, Aramaic was an international language. So now it's the fusing the language with the nation in the Middle East, something that Jonathan Valk, a Syriologist, would disagree with. He would say, well, leave the language alone. The language had nothing to do with the people named Aramu, okay? Even the ancient Assyrians saw that. They didn't see them as a people in the sense of a nationhood. There's no kind of comprehensive, coherent nationhood called Arameans historically, certainly not in the 7th century BC, and perhaps even in the 7th century AD. There is a language called Aramaic. But anyway, being native to Southeast Turkey, Lebanon, etc., Arameans have been reduced from a substantial majority to a minority, and now we are threatened with extinction. In their ancestral homelands, Arameans continue to struggle for survival. So the people in Iraq, calling themselves Chaldeans, Syriacs, Assyrians, they're all Arameans. Denominations with Aramean roots include, here we go, Syriac Orthodox, Syriac Catholic, Church of the East. Its members are inaccurately called Nestorians or Assyrians. So this is a little bit funny because Nestorian is placed on the same, put in the same status as Assyrians. Chaldean Catholics, Maronites, Rum Orthodox, and others, some who, of course, do not associate at all with Aramaic or Arameans. But anyway, Hebrew Bible's notes, again, the reference to the Hebrew Bible, that the Jews descend from the Arameans. The patriarchs Isaac and Jacob married their Aramean cousins from Aram Nahran and Padan Aram. And of course, this is the biblical version, but of course you have to know that this stuff is disputed by historians, archaeologically, textually, and so on. Again, reference to Jesus. Today's Hebrew script is an Aramaic script, which is called Kitav Ashuri. And the Arabic writing system originally derives from one of the Aramaic scripts. So there's an attempt to kind of cleanse the Aramean identity from the Assyrian. And why is it important? This is kind of advertised by the Aramean World Council. 5 reasons to say that we are Aramean and not Assyrian. You acknowledge that Arameans have separate history and distinct culture. We're not Assyrian. We are not anything else. We are not Christian. We're not, excuse me, Kurdish Christians and Turkish Christians or Arab. We are Arameans. You support the ethnic, linguistic, land rights of the Aramean people. So when there are land disputes, we support our people to maintain their connection to the land, this indigenous land. You strengthen transnational linkages between Arameans in various countries. We are dispersed all over the world, but we are going to connect ourselves because we are Arameans. You strengthen transnational linkages between, sorry, I'm repeating that. Oops. You recognize Aramean resilience and perseverance in the face of mass atrocities. So now, how different is that than, for example, the way Assyrians have historically expressed their identity and their history? Well, you have to really say not much different, okay? All right. So we understand the Aramean idea, and there are other players in this, but the primary person is Johnny Meso. The primary organization is the World Council of Arameans, and he is supported by some of the clergy, not necessarily all of the clergy. There was a question put before the Patriarch, His Holiness Afram of the Syriac Orthodox Church, and he just did not want to get into this discussion. And why? Because clearly he knew that this word is, that this is a battle that he did not want to go into at this time, because there were, in his mind, bigger issues to discuss. And this was a very contentious issue, not just within the, community of bishops and priests, but also within the larger community. All right, now that we understood this, let's go into the word Chaldean and come to understand how this term came about. And there you see the legendary figure of the Bible, Abraham, coming from Ur of the Chaldees. And we've talked about which Ur are we talking about? The one in southern Lebanon, or southern Mesopotamia? Or are we talking about the area of Urhe? Ur as in Urhe, or Ur as in Ur in Mesopotamia, in southern Mesopotamia. Well, let's understand where this word is used first. So where does it appear in the very beginning? Whoever used this word Chaldean in the very beginning? It was none other than the Assyrians. They used the word Keldu, first appeared in Assyrian royal inscriptions, 9th century BC, maybe a little before. And it referred not to a nation of people, but to a group of tribal people in the southern area, the area called the Sea Land. And these people were sometimes mixed with what were referred to as Arameans, but we do not have the writings of these people. So this is an exonym. It is certainly not a term used by themselves. It's certainly not self-identification. The people of the Sea Land did not use it. In the Neo-Babylonian period, in the late 7th century, Keldu tribal leaders gained influence in Babylon, but again, not as a nation. They referred to themselves as members of the Bityakan tribe, for example, and not necessarily of the Keldu. That term was applied by the Assyrians, again, exonym. The most famous was Nabopolassar, who was the founder of what is known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Now, before, in various Western literary traditions, the word Chaldean was used. This was the Chaldean dynasty, but this certainly is not the term. This was certainly not the self-identifying term. No king ever referred to himself as a Chaldean or Keldu. Not Nebuchadnezzar, not Nabopolassar, not Nabonidus, not a single of the Neo-Babylonian rulers. In fact, as we will see historically, all Assyriologists have said, there are no clay tablets from the Neo-Babylonian period self-identifying as Chaldeans. But in the Bible, Chaldean often meant astrologer or wise men, reflecting Babylon's reputation for astronomy or astrology. But it's also used, in Habakkuk it's used, the word Chaldean meant to mean something else. Greek authors, Herodotus, Xenophon, etc., used Chaldean in this sense. Early Syriac writers follow this line. In fact, Martuma Odu, in his dictionary, uses the same expression, although the word came to have a different meaning later. Let's kind of explore that. First, Saint Jerome uses this word. He was a Latin priest, confessor, and theologian, and he uses Keldi or Chaldean for Aramaic or Syriac. So the very first dictionary in Latin of the Syriac or Aramaic language uses the word Keldi in Latin. The term was inspired by the use in the Bible. And of course, this explains why later it was used. So again, where did the term come from? Professor at the University of Toronto, Paul-Elaine Blue, says, biblical authors apparently perceived Babylon as a state ruled and led by militarily at that time by West Semitic and tribal leaders, or i.e. Chaldeans or the Keldu. On the basis of this evidence, scholars have sometimes adopted the name Chaldean dynasty in reference to the royal house founded by the first king of the Neo-Babylonian period, Nabopolassar, at the end of the 6th century BC. But contrary to the Bible, he tells us, rulers of the Babylonian Empire never referred to their subjects or themselves as Chaldean or their army. When we turn to terms describing members of the ruling dynasty, we encounter a similar paucity of information. While the biblical evidence has imposed the term Chaldean dynasty, the Neo-Babylonian kings never adopted the designation Chaldean. Not only do we find no ancient claim for the Chaldean origin of the dynasty, but the term Chaldean does not appear even once in late Babylonian or Neo-Babylonian cuneiform documentation. So does it have a history? Is there self-identification of this term? Not according to people who study this ancient subject. Well, what about the modern period? How did this start? So in the mid-14th century, we need to understand this, a system of hereditary passage of the patriarchal position took place in the Church of the East. And according to the Encyclopedia of Catholicism, untrained minors were being elected. This is kind of the line that everybody uses as to the dispute that led to the split in the Church of the East. Untrained minors were being elected to the throne of the Patriarch, which was a very important position at that time. One such patriarch was elected in 1552. A group of Assyrian bishops refused to accept him and decided to seek union with Rome, not for the purpose of Christological shifting of their church, but to get assistance so they could have an election system again and get rid of the hereditary system that was in place. They elected what was labeled the reluctant abbot of the monastery of Rabban Hurmus, Yohanan Sulaqa, as their patriarch, and he was sent to Rome to arrange a union with the Catholic Church or to seek an alliance. In early 1553, Pope Julius proclaimed him patriarch, Simon the Eighth of the Chaldeans or of the Chaldees, and ordained him Bishop of St. Peter's Basilica on April 9th, 1553. When he came back to Assyria or to his homeland, he attempted to initiate reforms, but was met with strong opposition by what was then the Church of the East line in the village of Al-Qush, the Mar'iliya line, and he was soon captured by the Pasha of Amedia. He was tortured and he was executed in January of 1555. Then began a struggle between these two branches of the Church of the East. And you have to know at this time, just because one was called the Chaldean Church, there was no such understanding between these two parties that one is Chaldean and one is not. The word Chaldean was applied by Rome, and it was, believe it or not, accepted by many of our people. So formation of the Chaldean Catholic Church, Mar Yohannan Sulaqa is sent back with 2 Dominicans to educate Assyrians about the Roman Catholic Church. It's believed that he gives this impression that Marshamun VIII had died. Marshamun VIII declares Mar Yohannan to be an illegitimate patriarch, and so the battle begins. And after he is tortured and killed, Mar Odishu takes over. Only the Assyrians of Mardin and Diyarbakir follow Mar Yohannan Sulaqa in the beginning because he had left the area on orders from Marshamun. Mar Yohannan is arrested by the Turks, tortured and murdered, as we said. Sorry to repeat this. Mar Odishu then is elected the new patriarch of the United Church of the East, the Church of the East. He's unable to travel to Rome. Pope Pius recognizes him. By the way, he uses the word Assyrian also. He's the patriarch of the East Assyrians. And then others follow this line. Now, I don't want to go into detail, but at this time, the Church of the East was also diminishing. So besides the internal divisions within the Church of the East, the Church of the East on the outside of it is also losing a lot of members. In Jerusalem, 1616, and in Nisibis in 1556, in Baghdad 1553. So there's this kind of downfall and disintegration of the Church of the East, and it winds up again being largely in what we define as Assyria, in the area that we look, demographically Assyrian. After Mar Odishu, as we said, there was a period of confusion. Marshamun Yo'alaha follows. Marshamun Dinha follows from 1580 to 1600, reinstates hereditary succession and moves to Quchanos. Now, when there is a move to Quchanos, just so we understand the terminology that our people use, what is the word used for the patriarch? Who is a patriarch of in Quchanos? He is the patriarch of the Chaldeans. So the word Chaldean is also used by the people in Quchanos. And there's the allegiance to the Pope at this time too. Tenuous as it is, but there is an allegiance to the Pope, which later in the early 1800s disintegrates. The Church of the East, by the way, forms 3 patriarchates. There's one original one in Al-Qush. There's one formed in Diyarbakir when the Marshumuns go to Salamis. They migrate to Salamis before they migrate to Quchanos. And so there are these 3 patriarchs, all of them the Church of the East, the Hindi line in Diyarbakir, the Iliya line in Al-Qush, and the Marshamun line in Quchanos. And 2 of them, or all 3 of them at one point are reaching out, or Rome is reaching out to them and forming a union, then unforming that union. Eventually, the Church of the East in the Quchanos area cuts its ties with Rome in the 1800s, and then the line is formally formed by the line in Al-Qush, Mar Iliya line, and the line in Diyarbakir is discontinued in the early 1800s. So then the point is, the word Chaldean was used by all of these people, but it wasn't contradicting the word Suraya or even Athuraya. Okay, this is the important point to note, that these words were interchangeable rather than oppositional. Because we do have people within the Chaldean church saying clearly, based on tradition, we too, the Eastern Suraya Medan Chaya, descend from the Assyrians. We are the children of the Assyrians, or Ashur. Okay, this is the great Martuma Odu telling us based on learning from the church and also learning from the West. And we have this line repeated by others, such as Yusuf Malik. Chaldeans are of the same stock and family as the Assyrians. So their language is one, with the exception of minor religious beliefs, meaning the churches. There's no difference whatsoever between them. Their traditions, customs, and usages are one. So when I asked the question of whether these people are one, if they have a different imagined history, the answer was, well, yeah, it's important to recognize that. And here, this is being confirmed, about 100 years ago. Well, then we get my friend Reverend, and then later Bishop Sarhad Jammu, a very educated person, a very strong-headed person at the same time, who early on encouraged Assyrians and Chaldeans to come together, or people defining themselves Assyrians and Chaldeans, and later decided to go against this idea, unfortunately. And began to assert a kind of a separateness, a very clear division, and encourage the idea to spread among others, such as Maraman al-Delhi, who became patriarch after the death of Mar Yusuf Emmanuel of the Chaldean church, and he said, "We, the Chaldean, Assyrian, and Syrian people, are one people, known as Aramean people in the beginning," and then later said, "Any Chaldean who calls himself an Assyrian is a traitor, and any Assyrian who calls himself a Chaldean is a traitor." And Sargandana tells Delhi was present and seemingly supported the October 2023 Assyrian Democratic Movement Baghdad Conference, where the appellation Keldu Assyrian was used as an umbrella term. And I could tell you that's partially true. I was there. I had a conversation with the late patriarch about this issue, and he was very quiet. He was absorbing what was going on. He was unsure of the circumstances coming after the fall of the regime. Remember, he was a product of the church during the time of Saddam's regime. And in fact, according to Paul Bremer, he was very opposed later on. Although he first accepted the word, he was later opposed to the agreement between this one people and insisted on separating Assyrians from Chaldeans. And of course, we have pseudo-historians such as Amr Fatuhi, who's made a name for himself, making grandiose statements and saying things like, there was no Assyrian ethnicity in the past, and there will be none in the future. Not sure what he means exactly, but he was saying this in response to somebody. And Amr Fatuhi has, created himself this mythical history, and he opposes the idea that there was even any Assyrian ethnicity in the past, and he refers to something called Proto-Chaldean, reaching deep into the mists of the past, so on and so forth. And I don't want to say anything more about that other than that his whole message is that we are a separate people and there's no such thing as Assyrian. And anyway, those people, we don't want to have anything to do with them. They're mountaineers, or they're, X, Y, and Z, very derogatory terms, and that we are Chaldean and nothing more. And so we look back at people like Freydun Aturaya and what he tried to achieve and the message that he put forth. And then we see, the current patriarch of the Chaldean church saying various things like, we are definitely a separate people and we are not one. Now, whether this is a political understanding or not is to be, of course, debated. There are many who clearly say this is being done because of representation. We are, Marsako says, 80% or 85% of the population in Iraq, we being Chaldean. And by the way, the leadership is in my hands. I am the leader of this 85%, and therefore I should have, monetary support, financial, all kinds of, security support, recognition, and so on and so forth. So is it really a political move, or is it a sincere understanding of nationality or ethnicity? That is to be debated. Now, I want to tell you before I go to the late martyr who was killed, kidnapped, and killed in Iraq, Polis Faraj Raho, who was from the village of Karimlish and who was a very prominent archbishop in Iraq of the Chaldean Church. He did not believe in separation. He believed really in the Christian Suraya kind of understanding of our people, and he believed in Iraqi patriotism. This was probably the most important thing, but also recognizing that the true Iraqis are our people, okay, and no distinction between Chaldean or Church of the East or Syriac Orthodox, but we Christians who carried the cross, who suffered for centuries. And he said it, we Christians, Masihiyin, were here 600 years before them, meaning before the Arabs, meaning as a Christian people. So Christianity predated the arrival of the Arabs and Islam. And there are many, of course, also in the Chaldean church and in the who adopt this word Chaldean, such as I'll leave you with this quote and this book, which I'm sure we have in the library, a history, Tilkepe, past and present, by Father Michael Bezzi. And I leave you with this poem of Michael Bezzi and see if you are Assyrian, if you understand it or not, and how you react to it. And this is an expression not really of the recreation of a history, kind of the imagined history that Benedict Anderson was talking about in terms of formation of nationalism, but really love for village. Now he begins, he gives us in the preface, he says that I carry a box with me wherever I go in the world. I am from this village of Tilkepe, and I am a member of the Chaldean church, and I am a Chaldean. And I carry a box with me, and this box has, you know, upra of Tilkepe, the soil of Tilkepe, and it also has a stone from the walls of Nineveh, and it has some wheat because I remember the farmers of Tilkepe. And he leads his book with this poem in the Assyrian language, Tilkepe dushab kimmi, ya atrad babi yimmi, shimmach baninne immi, aprach bgolinne bdimmi, which means Tilkepe, you are honey in my mouth, kimmi, of course, pummi. Land of my father and mother, your name I bear with me, your soil I will mix with my blood. Bgolinne bdimmi. So there's this also understanding of love of village, love of tradition that becomes associated with this word Chaldean, and not necessarily oppositional to anything else, but just strong love of village, of the past that is disappearing, and the longing of these traditions that are being lost. And in this way, sort of the fighting of assimilation, in particularly in the West.